Gian DeLeon, and this is K11 Konversations, a podcast where we discuss the intersection between creativity, culture, and innovation in line with K11 Musea's social mission to incubate talent and propagate culture. This episode was recorded last year celebrating K11 Musea's partnership with Sothebys during a spring auction preview that took place at the cultural retail flagship, where another hyper-rare example of the moon shoes was showcased. This was subsequently acquired into K11's collection. Now, as Nike celebrates its 50th anniversary with a never-before-seen showcase at K11 Musea capturing Nike's legacy of progress, the 1972 moon shoe makes a triumphant return. Let's take a look again at the groundbreaking milestone this shoe represents, and to put Nike's 50 years of innovation into context. To do that, I'm speaking with collector, curator, and founder of the ShoeZeum, Jordan Geller. Geller was the Guinness World Record holder for the largest collection of sneakers, clocking in at an astonishing 2,388 pairs. But he's also broken records at Sothebys, where a pair of Nike Moon Racers from his collection sold at auction in 2019 for $437,000 alongside 99 other collectible pairs. The record was broken just a year later by a pair of Air Jordan 1s worn by Michael Jordan himself in the iconic Chicago colorway. Those sold for $560,000. I caught up with Jordan Geller at his home in Oregon, right in Nike's backyard, and we talk about, well, Jordans, of course. Here's Jordan Geller. Jordan, thanks so much for joining me today. Let's just start at the beginning. Your first pair of Jordans, like myself, my parents never bought me Jordans. I had to buy them. I had to buy any sort of name brand sneaker, especially Nike. I've had to buy with my own money. In your case, that was 1996, and that was a pair of the Bred Jordan 11s. This is a shoe for all Jordan heads, right? The 11 has a very special significance. Can you shed some background as to why the 11 is such a special shoe to fans of Jordan the man, but also Jordan the sneaker brand in particular?
The Air Jordan 11 was a game-changing sneaker. We had never seen anything like it before it came out. First and foremost, the patent leather uppers were just so shocking to see on a basketball shoe. On top of that, they had revolutionary technology in them with the carbon fiber shank plate in the sole. And at the time when Tinker Hatfield was designing the Air Jordan 11, Michael Jordan was actually retired and he was off playing baseball. And so Tinker took it upon himself to go ahead and design this shoe, not really knowing if Michael Jordan would ever actually come back and wear it. And sure enough, Michael came back. And one of the things that he had mentioned along the way to Tinker was that it would be cool to have a shoe that could be dressed up and worn formally. So maybe that's what inspired Tinker to go with the patent leather. But anyway, Michael Jordan ended up coming back from retirement. The 95-96 season is when the Bulls went 72-10 and went ahead and won the championship. This was MJ's fourth championship and the first one that he won after his retirement and after his father had passed away. And it was a very emotional win for Michael. They won the game on Father's Day. He collapsed on the court, hugging the ball, wearing the black and red Air Jordan 11s. They're just incredible shoes, and the things that he did on the court in them are so iconic.
And speaking of icons, right, the reason I asked about the 11, it's like sort of being one for the heads, given how in recent years we've seen, obviously the Jordan 1, the OG silhouette designed by Peter Moore, have a new significance in the mainstream sort of consciousness, right? I mean, everybody loves the Jordan 1 more than ever, I feel like. What is it about that shoe that you think makes it such a strong symbol of style, but also classic sport at a global scale?
The Air Jordan 1 is just so iconic. And you look at it and it makes you feel a certain way. I mean, it brings you back to the time when it came out. And like the Air Jordan 11, it was game changing, only 10 or 11 years even before that. This was the first time that Nike ever created a signature line of shoes for an athlete. And the shoes were so bright and colorful in the white, red, and black, and in the black and red, that they were so shocking to see, and they really stood out. Nike produced more than 20 different colors of the Air Jordan 1 way back in 1985. And, fast forward now, 36 years later, and there's countless Air Jordan 1s, and the shoe really serves as a blank canvas for all sorts of different inspirations, materials, colors.
Yeah, I mean, I did an interview with Peter Moore a while back, right? And he talked about how the way that he made the panels was so it would take color blocking in a certain way. And to see, that shoe come into prominence, it reminds me of this way of thinking that I've always had, right? Was that there will be sort of a moment when the Jordan 1 will sort of become the new Chuck Taylor in a sense, wherein, the Chuck Taylor, by Converse, of course, was also a shoe named after a famous basketball player that became so emblematic and sort of a canvas in its own right for different lifestyles. And with the Jordan 1, it had a second life in skate, and now working with artists like Travis Scott, designers like Virgil Abloh, fashion labels like Dior, it's sort of become, I guess, the new iteration of that, and it feels more modern in that way. Would you agree?
That's a really cool comparison that I've never thought of before. And yes, I do agree with you. It's interesting to think like that because the Converse Chuck Taylor was so simplistic. I mean, we're talking about a shoe that's 100 years old. I think the first ones were made in 1919, if my memory serves me correctly. And, that shoe was so simple. But at the time, it was ahead of its time, and the technology in it was revolutionary. But now we look at it and we're like, wow, that's, like canvas on cardboard soles, basically. And now the Air Jordan 1, similarly, when that came out with the Nike Air technology, I mean, that was revolutionary. And now fast forward to 2021, and we've got basketball shoes that lace themselves up on your feet and all different kinds of Air technology. And it's amazing to think about it. It's starting back then, and what you were saying, that the Jordan is like the Chuck Taylor.
Right. But, speaking of history and going back, well, first, I want to verify something. You hold the Guinness World Record for largest collection of sneakers at, I think it was 2,388 pairs. Is that how many you still have? I also saw another number that said you owned around 2,504.
So I'm in the book of Guinness World Records for the world's largest sneaker collection with 2,388 pairs, like you said. When the ShoeZeum was open to the public, there were actually 2,504 pairs on display. So you got that number too. I don't still own all of those shoes. In fact, I have sold most of them. Interestingly, at one point, I actually owned 15,000 pairs of shoes.
Oh, wow.
But that was not a personal collection. I used to buy sneakers at the factory stores and resell them online. And at one point, my inventory, which were all my shoes, was more than 15,000 pairs. But I never thought to reach out and try to claim a world record for it or anything like that. What made the ShoeZeum so special was that it truly was a personal collection. All the shoes were in my size, brand new, in the boxes. So I was able to say, this is my sneaker collection, and that became the world's largest.
So you mentioned, selling and reselling sneakers from the factory store. I think there's a couple of threads there. First, I just want to get your take on how the secondary sneaker market and reselling in general has blown up in the past 5 years, 10 years into, a $1 billion industry, it seems, in its own right. What's your take, right? Because there's a Forbes article on how it's an asset class now.
It's wild. And I'm thrilled to see it happening and to see the industry growing and the secondary market growing. When I started buying and reselling shoes, it was more than 20 years ago, and the times were very different back then. There weren't a whole lot of different marketplaces to be able to sell them. I mean, really, it was eBay. And then there were a few different blogs like Nike Talk.
Nike Talk, I remember that one as well, yeah.
Where the sneakerheads would gather and talk about our shoes. But it was very much an underground thing.
Right. And for people who weren't aware of Nike Talk, right, it was a forum you would buy, sell, and trade. And the fun but also aggravating part is like going peer-to-peer with questions like, what's the serial number? Can I see photos of the box? What's the corner look like? And how granular those interactions could get for $20, $30, $50 over retail sometimes.
Yeah. And Nike Talk had a whole bunch of different threads that you could go on and read about and chime in and participate in. One of my favorite ones were about all the Nike factory stores based on geography. So there would be like the Southwest Nike factory stores and like the Northeast Nike factory stores. There would just be people like running around, looking at what was there, taking pictures and saying, hey, like this is what's out there. I didn't really use that to lead my navigation during my resale business, but it was a fun tool to see people talking about. But anyway, way back in the day, I used to run around to the factory stores, buy Nike shoes for dirt cheap, and tell the stories behind the shoes, the history and heritage of them, and sell them online to people that were thrilled to buy them.
Back in those days, I feel it was easier to come up on, a gold mine at the factory stores as opposed to now. Back then, you would see more sort of underappreciated or rarer sneakers more likely to turn up.
Oh, yeah. You wouldn't believe the things that I've found and bought and the prices that I paid.
What are some of like the craziest things that you found at a factory store?
Sometimes I used to go in there and buy shoes for $4.99 and $9.99 on clearance.
Oh, wow.
Like they were just looking to get rid of the old stock or the extreme sizes, the really small ones and the really big ones. And they would call me up. And I mean, eventually I formed relationships with the people at the stores and they would call me up and say, hey, we're marking down all of this stuff. And I would go in and buy like Nike Shocks for $5. Hundreds of them. I bought Nike Wovens for $9.99. I went all over the country and bought Nike Air Riffs. I never paid more than $29.99 for them. Most of them were $9.99 or $19.99. Wow. And a lot of these shoes have cult followings internationally. So like the Air Rift, for example.
And that's the sandal Velcro with like the tabby toe.
Yes, yeah. Exactly. So those things originally came out in the mid-90s. They were actually a marathon shoe made for Kenyan runners that typically ran barefoot. And so Nike tried to recreate a shoe that was similar to barefoot running. So they had the split toe, like you were saying, and a couple Velcro straps. And this was like a really niche cult shoe. But years later, it took off and became like a fashion icon, especially in the UK. There were websites dedicated just to the Air Rift. There was this one called J600, and it had every colorway of the Air Rift that you could imagine. They couldn't sell these things in the United States, so they would mark them down. $29.99, $19.99, $9.99, sometimes $4.99. And the Rifts themselves came with these special split-toe socks that you could only get with the Rifts that people also loved. And I used to go to the stores, call the stores on the phone. They would ship them to me. They were happy to get rid of them. And then I would sell them overseas to people in the UK in Great British pounds. I'd sell the socks separately. The people were thrilled to buy them. And like, this is how I built my business, doing stuff like this. But there weren't a bunch of people like me looking around for Air Riffs and like strategically putting them in the UK.
Yeah, and I think that sort of regional release thing is something that Nike's become hip to, where like if a certain silhouette is popular in Japan or a certain silhouette is popular in Europe, ultimately they sort of figured out a way to make special shoes that they knew would resonate in those markets over time. Speaking of the Air Rift and that split toe, Nike kind of channeling that heritage in these newer silhouettes and taking things, to a bit more technical, weirder in a good way level with silhouettes like the Road Warrior or the Overreact.
That ISPA shoe that you're talking about with the split toe and the crazy like shocks cushioning and the waffle and the elongated outsole is so cool. And I really want to get it. Like in that light colorway, the like white cream beige, I'm not sure what color they call it, but it's so cool. It's so cool that Kanye West tweeted about it being cool and he's got his own Adidas brand. Yeah. So like that says a lot.
Right. That's like Charles Barkley being like, Michael Jordan is better at basketball than I am in The Last Dance, I feel like.
So I think that comment said a lot. Those shoes are super funky. I have seen them in person, but I don't own a pair. And I would like to get a pair for sure.
And the reason I ask about those is from like a design and silhouette perspective, right? I mean, we could go on for hours about retros and like sort of new takes on old models. But when it comes to things that sort of stand the test of time or weren't appreciated when they first came out, do you think those silhouettes will have that kind of impact, or what will really stand and hold value in the next couple of years? Will it be X colorways of a Jordan 1, like a Travis Scott Jordan 1, or will it be these sort of new silhouettes that stand for innovation and Nike continuing to do what it was known for, which is sort of pushing the bar forward between form and function?
It's tough to say right away what something will do in, 10 and 20 years. The newer models are wild. I mean, they're just crazy. And in a lot of ways, as these shoes become more and more infused with technology, the shoes sort of become like a photograph of that moment in time, because technology improves so quickly that things change so rapidly. You think about like shoes that Nike made that used to light up, 5 years ago or 7 years ago, and how archaic the battery system was and the charging mechanism and all of that versus where that has gone. And then also like the self-lacing shoes. And so I think as we see more and more of the technology that's available being infused into the shoes will be like, oh, wow, those are from that moment in time when that stuff was available.
Right. Speaking of, sneakers as snapshots of moments in time, I feel like we have to talk about the moon shoes. We got to talk about the waffle racers. And, one of the pairs of moon shoes that you had, a literal dead stock pair, I think you described them as fresh off the waffle iron from the condition they were in. They broke an auction record at Sothebys, $437K as part of like this collection of 100 classic sneakers. When did you shift your interest and passion from, Jordans to sort of the OG classic Nike designs like the waffle racer? And what piqued your interest in those in particular?
Well, I'm glad that we're talking about that shoe because I have a lot of things that I want to share with you about it. I think the moon shoe is just so special. It's really, truly the roots of Nike. And as Nike has become more keen on sneakerheads and the resale market and on collaborating with the Travis Scotts of the world and making limited edition sneakers, I've gravitated towards the roots of Nike. I like to think of Nike as a tree. And I think of the branches as the sports. So, here's running and here's basketball and cross training, skateboarding, hiking. And you can imagine the evolution of each of those categories over time. And to me, the shoes are like leaves on the tree. And the tree keeps getting bigger and more beautiful. But there's something really sacred about the roots and the beginning of the tree.
I think Nike World Headquarters is like the perfect analog to what you're saying, right? The first building is literally named after Steve Prefontaine. And it has, its history sometimes literally embedded in the halls where it has like the version of the van Phil Knight was selling like the OG waffle racers out of too. So, and for people who don't know, it's like every building is named after a famous Nike athlete. There's of course the Michael Jordan building. Not hard to imagine what kind of shoes you might find in there. But to your point, I think it is so key to Nike's DNA that if you're a visitor, you literally walk through it. That's the first thing you see, I feel like.
I live in Nike's backyard. From my kitchen window, you can look out and see the Nike buildings. And I love being so close. When you walk into Nike, it's just gorgeous. And it's like a campus. And like you're saying, the buildings are named after athletes. And some of the newer buildings are also named after iconic shoes. The first building as you approach is Steve Prefontaine Hall. And when you walk in there, there are about 5 or 6 shoes on display. And one of them is the Nike Moon shoe, which sits next to Bill Bowerman's original waffle iron. I actually have the same model waffle iron right here. So Bill Bowerman in the early 70s was tinkering around with a waffle iron just like this that him and his wife got as a wedding present. It's an Art Deco waffle iron from the 1930s. And Bowerman was pouring compounds into this, like rubber and different kinds of material, eventually to create this, which is the waffle sole for a shoe. And the very first Nike that Bowerman ever put the waffle sole on was the Moon shoe. So the Moon shoe represents the first of the first. It's like the first shoe with the first big Nike innovation. I found Mark Covert on Facebook, who was the runner that crossed the finish line in the 1972 Olympic trials wearing a pair of Moon shoes. Here's a picture of him. You can look closely and see on his feet are those Nike Moon shoes. And so I met Covert on Facebook. We became friends. And I bought his Moon shoes 9 months later, and they're my holy grail. Like beyond sacred to me. They represent the very beginning of Nike. Fast forward a few years later, and I found the dead stock pair. Mm-hmm. And I bought them, not really with any intention of selling them, but just because I thought it would be so cool to have a brand new pair to complement Mark Covert's pair.
Speaking of holy grails, like what was it like to find a Bowerman pair eventually? There was like a pair that was buried, I guess, in his backyard that is also part of your collection.
That waffle iron that was dug up in Bowerman's yard, the person that dug it up also found an old Moon shoe, a single handmade waffle, and he asked Bowerman's son if he could have it. And the guy said yes. And then that guy eventually contacted me and sold me that shoe. And so, yes, I also have a shoe that was buried next to that waffle iron on the Bowerman estate. And these things, they're more than things to me. They're sacred and they're holy and they're artifacts. And it's just incredible to see them and to hold them.
Yeah, speaking of artifacts and you know, working with Sothebys on this, what is it like to have the Moon shoes sitting next to works of art from various eras, but also from famous artists like Takashi Murakami, Moaka Boafo, and you know, these other pieces that are definitely worthy of admiration and appreciation?
It's unbelievable. I mean, really, truly, it's unbelievable. So getting back to that brand new Moon shoe and my relationship with Sothebys. So we met in 2019, and Sothebys was putting on a sneaker auction with 100 pairs of shoes. And my Nike Moon shoe was included in that collection. Now, I actually flew out to New York with the Moon shoes to hand deliver them because I didn't feel comfortable shipping them. And when I walked into Sotheby's, it was magnificent. Walking in from York Street, there's like flags of all these different countries. You walk in, there was an Aston Martin parked right in the lobby. The lobby was gorgeous. The people that worked there were so nice. They immediately asked, you know, can we take your bags and jacket? And I had the privilege of getting to actually set up the Moon shoe in their vitrine, in the case, with the lights on it and a waffle iron, just like I showed you. And like you're saying, like, I'm surrounded by these gorgeous works of art where the frames alone are works of art, like these beautiful gold frames. And it was just like, wow, sneakers have really made it and they've really come so far.
And, you know, speaking of that and coming farther than ever, the only shoe, you know, to beat that auction at $437,000 for the Moon shoe was also a shoe that came from you. It's the game-worn Jordan 1 Chicago, signed by Michael Jordan, that broke records at $560,000. What was that like when that moment happened? And tell us a bit about how you came across that particular pair. I think it's interesting how they're two different sizes too. I think there's so much history we can talk about there.
Yes, so that's another incredible pair of shoes that we sold, Sothebys and I, in May of 2020. And that sale happened during the Last Dance and the Michael Jordan craze that overtook the world. It was just an unbelievable experience. I bought that pair of shoes in 2012. I've had them in my collection, and I didn't have any intention of selling those either. But Michael Jordan mania took over the world, and I was seeing what things were selling for. There was this game-worn Olympic jersey that sold for over $200,000. And that exact same jersey sold for about $50,000 not that long before. And then Michael Jordan's basketball cards were selling for six figures. And like some of these other shoes that he wore were approaching six figures. And I felt like, wow, I've got this amazing pair of shoes that I really was planning on keeping and giving to my kids. But I thought the opportunity was right to offer it to the world via Sotheby's, the best marketplace in the world, during the right time, and just see what happened. And I was very confident, actually, that the Jordan would break the moon shoe record, because the Jordan is more iconic. When you put the Air Jordan 1 in front of somebody, you don't need to tell them anything. They just look at it and get it. But the moon shoe required an explanation. Like, oh, this was handmade by the founder of Nike, and he was working with his wife's waffle iron. And, there's a whole story that goes into the moon shoe. Not that that takes anything away from it. It's incredible. But the Jordan 1 is so culturally important. It's like Michael Jackson's Thriller or Beat It. It just takes you back to 1985. And so I felt like putting that out there in the market, it was kind of my and Sotheby's way of contributing to what was already going on. And it just felt incredible to make that sale.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, it goes back to our earlier talking point about the Jordan 1 becoming a canvas in its own right. And, to the point about sneakers standing next to these art pieces in terms of K11 and Sothebys, but also sneakers being art pieces in their own right. Jordan has done collaborations with KAWS. He's worked with artists like Barry McGee, of course, Stash, Futura, the list goes on. And of course, fashion houses like Dior and designers like Kim Jones. And I think there's so many levels to, I guess, people's relationship with sneakers. Bill Bowerman, has that quote at Nike. It's literally in the halls about if you have a body, you're an athlete. Do you feel like now, if you're into sneakers, then by default, you're sort of a sneakerhead?
Yes, I do. I think the amount of sneakerheads has grown exponentially and continues to grow daily. They're so cool and there's so much to love about them that it's easy to fall in love with sneakers. And it's only getting bigger and better. And I think as we see more and more of these limited collabs, like the KAWS ones and the Dior ones, it's only going to push the value up of the old original stuff that was never made to be collected. Right. Something really interesting about those game-worn Air Jordan 1s and looking at them as art. I've had many brand new Air Jordan 1s, like perfect, crispy, in the box, even with the original receipt and all that. Mm-hmm. But when you looked at Michael Jordan's pair that had all of like the scuffs and the marks and the creases, that is what became art. It was like all of what Michael Jordan did to them turned those into one of a kind, unique art. And I've really gravitated towards game-worn shoes since that sale, because I think that those shoes represent a moment in time. And it's so cool to look at them and see like, wow, look what Kareem Abdul-Jabbar wore. Look at how he beat up this pair of old Adidas that are this big, or other amazing players.
That's a great segue into owning moments, right? Because one of the things that has certainly been taking the art world by storm, and also by and large, the collecting community, right? If the sneaker community is one small section of the collecting community at large, I want to talk about non-fungible tokens, NFTs. Of course, with NBA Top Shots, it's taken that trading card model and applied it to sporting moments, slam dunks, games, etc., or players in some cases. And we're seeing that as it applies to sort of virtual products and virtual sneakers. Do you think that's a space where, people who might not be able to own, let's say, a game-worn Jordan 1 or let's say like a Travis Scott 1 or a Cause Jordan 4, do you think that'll be a viable method of people being able to access these kinds of products virtually in some way, shape, or form?
I don't fully understand NFTs, so I'm probably not the right person to have a deep conversation about them with. I don't really get it. To me, as a collector, I want to actually have the physical item. Mm-hmm. But I understand that not everybody can have that physical item and that maybe a digital copy of it is the way to go. I'm sure there are benefits to it. One that I can think of is theft. Right. It's probably harder to steal an NFT than it is to steal a pair of shoes. But I don't know. Only time will tell. It's crazy, that sale that just took place, $69 million for the NFT art.
It's crazy. But I do get what you're saying, right? Because it's the difference between, watching a game that's been recorded and then being there at the stadium in person. I feel like those are two different experiences. And, you can experience some of the same moment, but, again, to have that physicality, I think for products like sneakers in particular, is so important to, fully immerse you, I guess, in that universe. And lastly, we've been talking a lot about older shoes and things that have been worn on the court and things that have stood the test of time. In that vein, I want to ask, what are some of your favorite recent releases?
Well, there's this pair of mules that I just can't stop wearing. They're called Offlines, made by Nike, and you just slide right in. I think they're like the perfect shoe for the pandemic and just like wearing around the house. But that's been my go-to for like almost the last year. And other than that, I just stick with my classics. I have a pair of Air Jordan 3s that I wear all the time, Air Jordan 1s and 11s.
What colorways, though? By the way, I run an account called Mule Boy, so this is definitely going to end up on that Instagram, the Nike Offline plug. You mentioned your Jordan 3 1s. What colorways are we running?
I wear the black and cement 3s. I wear a pair of Chicago 1s. I wear the black and red 11s. Those are my go-tos, really.
What do you think of the retro high 85s and the sort of other remastered versions of that shoe? Like, to you, having seen the 85 versions and having seen so many iterations of the shoe down the line, what to you, other than the 85, is the closest one can get to like that OG appeal?
Well, from a broader perspective, I think it's really cool that Nike is trying to recreate the shoes as close to the way that they were when they originally came out. That's a relatively newer thing. I mean, I say relatively newer, like in the last 8 years or so, when they announced their remastered line and there were pictures of them dissecting shoes to try to recreate them in the same shapes. Times change, and materials change, and you're never going to be able to recreate something right now that's exactly the way that it was back in 1985. And even if you could, how could you test like, this is what it was like in 1985. You're looking at something that's 36 years old and comparing it with something that just came out. I think a lot of what has driven the whole idea of making the stuff more OG is the secondary market, and that sneakerheads care. Because in the early 2000s, we were just lucky to get a retro. Straight up, we were just lucky to get a retro. And before that, they didn't even make retros. And people weren't picking apart the shoes the way that they are now. There wasn't social media, and there weren't people that collected all the different iterations of them and were like looking at the stitching and the heels and the tabs and the every little thing. And that's driven a lot of change at Nike. The OG1 highs look great, and they look much more like the original ones than the earlier ones from the 2000s that were mids with Jumpman logos on the tongues. But honestly, nobody cared because we were just like stoked to get them. So,
For sure.
It's just an evolution, and an evolution for the better. And honestly, it's probably easier and more difficult for Nike because like they don't have to do any R&D to make the shoe, but it's difficult in the sense that people are like looking at this stuff with magnifying glasses, pointing out what's different and the way it should be.
Right. Well, Jordan, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
K11 Conversations is brought to you by K11 Musea and produced by Sonia Manalili and hosted by me, Gian DeLeon. Stay tuned for future episodes.